Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Western New England University. I'm Art Wolf. I have the privilege of serving as the director of our Institute for Legislative and Governmental Affairs. President Anthony Caprio could not be here today. He's out of town on official business. So he's asked me to bring the warm welcoming to each of you for being here today. And we especially thank Chairman Crosby and the members of the commission for their organizing this educational forum for all of us here in the West and maybe the East as well to learn more about the exciting issues that arise in the course of the Gaming Commission's proceedings. So again, we welcome you all here. We hope you have an enjoyable afternoon. And I have the additional privilege of introducing you, if you need an introduction, to the Executive Director of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, Mr. Tim Brennan.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this educational forum, and I put the emphasis on educational. Especially want to welcome to Western Massachusetts Chairman Crosby and the other members of the Casino Gaming Commission. We're here to learn today, and I'm happy to say that this particular forum is the best attended thus far, which I think is a credit to Western Massachusetts and our level of interest in learning and helping one another to go through this process. We have an ambitious agenda this afternoon. As opposed to previous forums, we're actually tackling three subjects. Community mitigation, which will be the first panel that I'll moderate. The second being the alignment or the attempt to align a casino resort here in Western Mass with the hospitality industry. And last but certainly not least, the issue of workers, how workers connect to the jobs that this casino for the western part of the state will generate in a municipality and the region at large. To get us started, though, this afternoon, we want to welcome a legislator who was part of the architects team that put this legislation together. Senator Gail Canderas represents a good portion of the city of Springfield. But I can recall that long ago when the legislation was going to be crafted and we sat with her, it was evident that her credentials as a former local official, select board member, planning board member, helped her understand the kind of concerns that we had. So please welcome Senator Gail Canderas.
Thank you, Tim, and to all of our distinguished guests here today. It is an honor to have been able to participate in putting this together. Obviously, we're very excited that you're all here at the Legislative Institute for Governmental Affairs. This venue was created expressly. The Institute was created expressly to provide venues for just these types of events and make available to the people of Western Massachusetts the kinds of opportunities they have in the eastern part of the state. I am delighted with the level of interest that has been shown by potential developers in obtaining, being the winners of the license here to develop a Western Mass casino. A little bit of the backstory: when Senator Rosenberg, whom I'll have the privilege of introducing shortly, was working on this legislation, we all had an opportunity to provide input. And one of the things they do in Boston from time to time is hire consultants. And they had a consultant who actually was saying that we would have to work extra hard in Massachusetts, maybe even lowering the licensing fees because they doubted there would be much interest in a Western Massachusetts license by developers. And so we pointed out to them, Senator Rosenberg and Senator Welch, who's joined us in the back, that we thought we knew our district better than the consultants, and we were pretty sure there was going to be intense interest by developers in a Western Mass license. And as you can see, Western Mass is absolutely the hot spot in the entire state for developers, proposed casino developers. So we're really excited with the way this has shaken out here in Western Massachusetts. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you today about as fine a gentleman as I've ever met. He is the architect of the gaming legislation that's going to be discussed today. His name is Senator Stan Rosenberg. He is also the Senate President pro tempore of the Massachusetts Senate. He was first elected in 1991. He is a Massachusetts born and bred and UMass graduate. He has always done extraordinary work in the Senate. He is the gentleman who twice now has handled the redistricting. As you know, we redistrict every 10 years. And he has done it under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. He is about as well regarded in the Senate and throughout the Commonwealth as anyone who has ever served. He has a very broad range and a lot of big responsibilities. So without further ado, it is my pleasure and privilege to present my great colleague, Senator Stan Rosenberg.
Well, thank you, Senator Canderas, and thank you to Western New England University for hosting this event, and thank you especially to the Commission for moving around the state and providing an opportunity for people to learn firsthand from the people who are working to make this law work, exactly what's going on and how this all is coming together. And I want to offer great commendations to my dear colleague, Senator Canderas, who has served this region so well, both in the House and in the Senate, and she understates her role on economic development matters, including this matter, and I just want to give her a pat on the back for the work she's done. And to thank Senator Jim Welch, who is also here, and a relative newcomer to the Senate, but a very welcome one. Having succeeded in the House, he moved over to the Senate, where we do it even better. So, my job today is to create the context for the conversation today. And I'm supposed to tell you how we got here. And how we got here was a long and torturous route that went over several decades, as there has been discussion in Massachusetts about joining the now 38 other states, but back in the time when it started, there were probably 15 or 20 states. But now we're state number 38 to involve ourselves with expanded gaming, including resort casinos. And the initial debates were around slots at the racetracks, and eventually expanded to the question of resort-style casinos, because that's where the jobs and the maximum revenue is if you have resort-style casinos. And we know this very well because we're just a stone's throw away from Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun, and we see what has happened down there in terms of economic development and tax revenues, and so we can see the model right there. When we reached the point where Governor Patrick was taking office, he was introduced to this topic because the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe had an application pending before the Bureau of Indian Affairs for federal recognition. And that application had been pending for a while, but it was getting very close to the point where it could be approved. And the Mashpee said that when they got their recognition and when they got their land in trust is reservation, they would exercise their federally granted and protected rights to do gambling on their land. The governor understood at that point that if they were to go down that path, and they said they would, that it would be untaxed, unregulated, and there could be no state interference because the Mashpee would be a recognized sovereign people, and our state government could not interfere in their operations in relation to gaming. And that they would be able to do gaming at the highest level that the Commonwealth's laws allowed at the time. At the time, bingo licenses were issued by the government, as well as Las Vegas night licenses to nonprofit organizations. That means that the tribe would be able to do bingo of their choosing, including electronic bingo. And electronic bingo, to the average person, is indistinguishable from slot machines. There are actually some technical differences, and if you want me to bore you later, I will be happy to explain them. But suffice it to say that they are effectively slot machines. And those would be untaxed, unregulated, and there could be no state interference with it. However, if they wanted to do casinos, the law would have to be changed. And if the law were changed to allow casinos, then a compact would have to be negotiated between the tribe as a sovereign people and the Massachusetts state government. That compact negotiation is the mechanism by which the state gets to enter into an agreement that includes taxation, regulation, law enforcement, and a range of other things that can be and are usually negotiated as part of the compact. And again, the word compact in this case is actually a substitute for the word treaty between two governments. So the reality set in that a tribe was about to be federally recognized. They would get their land in trust. They would then do gambling on that land. And if we didn't move to resort-style casinos, the governor knew that he would not be able to do any taxation or regulation. So at that point, he dispatched his staff to prepare a gaming bill. The gaming bill went through the legislative process and died in the House. The next term, a set of bills were filed by different people. Some of them looked like the governor's bill, some of them looked very different. A 2-year process ensued. At the end of that 2-year process, a bill actually got to the governor's desk. The governor didn't like some provisions of it and sent it back with amendments. It was at the end of the legislative term, the end of the legislative formal sessions, which meant that after July 31st, any single member could stop consideration of any bill. It was clear this bill was dead because there was no time to entertain the governor's amendments. We come back for the term that we're in now, and you all know the story. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here today with a commission and people wearing T-shirts of various colors and people trying to get themselves ready and organized to compete for a license. So the law is now in place. I was reminded that the law was signed 9 months ago, and the commission was fully formed April 1st, which was about 4 months ago. And this week, from yesterday's meeting until tomorrow, they went through the process at the Gaming Commission of agreeing to start the process of receiving applications and the $400,000 filing fee, non-refundable, in order to apply so you can pre-qualify for consideration for submitting an actual application. I would argue that that's a lot of work in a short period of time and done properly and done very well. So now the race is on, and if any of you happen to have your $400,000 check with you, before you give it to the commissioners, could I hold it for just a minute? Because I've never held a $400,000 check. I want to see what it feels like to hold that check. But the game is now moving to the next level. The commission will move on to pre-qualifying and checking the credentials and the veracity of people who want to put in an actual application. And then the application will be, the competition will be on for considering how many licenses, where within each region they would be, and who will be the outfit selected to move on to actually receive a license and construct the gaming operation. So that's the story. That's how we got to today, and you're going to hear from a lot of good people today about a lot of the particulars of what's involved in putting this together in greater detail. And I think I've discharged my duty of giving you the overview of how we got here, and I'll wish you all a very successful forum, and hope that you all get the information you need so that as citizens you can participate actively in this extraordinary social and economic change that is in the process of being unfolded before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I've been told that over the past, I think, 15 to 20 years, as Senator Rosenberg has traveled around the country, he's added a few days onto his vacation to meet gaming authorities in other states and jurisdictions so that when a bill was finally passed, and myself and my colleagues on the commission have heard this numerous times, we've been told Massachusetts got it right. So it's a credit to the legislative process. It's a credit to Senator Rosenberg and Senator Canderas, Senator Welch, and the legislators who are here with us. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Bruce Stebbins. I'm a member of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. As the Senator said, we've been on the job officially as a team for about 4 months. I'm glad to welcome my 4 colleagues to Western Massachusetts. I'm glad they were able to experience the commute I get every once in a while. I did send them via Pittsfield, so it made it seem a little bit longer. But I just want to take a minute and share with you really the purpose of these forums. We have held several of these around the state. This is the first one in Western Massachusetts. As Tim Brennan mentioned, it's certainly the most well-attended. The purpose of these forums are really to educate the 5 of us. There are a number of topics related to the bill that we are trying to get our hands around. How do we craft regulations? We do that with getting a lot of good information from experts, panelists, and from general comments from the public. We invite you to be a part of this education process because we want to give you the opportunity to hear the same information that we're hearing. After the panels speak, the commissioners will have the opportunity to ask some questions. At the end, we will have an open meeting of the commission to talk amongst ourselves about some of the topics. But we also want to take an opportunity to hear from you. And what we're doing to accommodate that is you'll see over against the wall, we have a nice box. It just shows you the extent to which the commission will spend money to get a nice box. We invite you to go over, drop in questions, drop in comments. I can promise you every comment and question will be responded to, but we will go through those comments and questions and take out those. And again, we hope that you address those comments and questions in particular to the topics that you are hearing about today. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you, you can also follow the Commission's activities through another variety of means. We have a general comments email line. We encourage everybody to drop us a note through the general comments email line. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We won't tell you when we're stepping out for lunch, but we'll share with you more important details than that. As Tim mentioned, we have 3 very important panels, and this is the first time that we have tried to address 3 important panels in one forum. Community mitigation, which is a big issue for the Commission itself to get our arms around. For Western Massachusetts, the idea of a $500 million construction project is a rather daunting task. And we think we have some good panelists up here to help communities get a better understanding of how do we facilitate that, how do communities deal with that large a project coming into their community. Secondly, we want to talk about tourism. Throughout the legislation, I don't think this was any accident, the legislature made it clear that they wanted gaming to have a positive impact on tourism. Tourism and hospitality is the 3rd biggest industry in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We certainly want to make sure that there's a marriage between gaming and tourism that will bolster not only jobs but revenues to the state. And finally, job training and workforce development. One thing that we're anxious not to see is once a license is approved, that there's a big importation of people to fill jobs when we feel we can create the training environment and the resources to help people from Massachusetts be able to apply for the permanent jobs. I want to thank Senator Candaris, and on this last point, she reminded me the other day that this bill really was passed because it is a jobs bill. Not only the temporary construction jobs, but the permanent tourism and hospitality and gaming jobs, as well as what we hope will be ancillary jobs throughout the community. Senator Rosenberg said that the work of this commission and our purpose is not to fight the notion of gaming. That is all going to happen within your own community when all of you as residents have a chance, should your community potentially be a host community, you'll have the opportunity to go to the polls and voice your opinion in that manner. But Senator Rosenberg said it is the job of this commission to make the law work, to protect the interests, to mitigate unintended consequences, maximize job development, and create a robust gaming environment. So I want to thank you for all turning out today. This is a great crowd. We greatly appreciate it. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim Brennan to begin the first panel.
So the subject is community mitigation, and I'm going to play two roles. I'm going to play the role of moderator, but also speaker. We have two others. In addition, I'm going to introduce them individually. To kick off, I'm going to call on Ed Harrison. Ed has and continues to chair the Western Mass Casino Advisory Task Force, group that actually came together in 2007. So we've been at this for quite a long time. Ed grew up, spent a good portion of his youth here in the city, retired from a career at Mass Mutual, and has been spending much of his retirement time doing duty as select board member in a variety of local committees. Ed?
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to the Commission for allowing us to make a little presentation here on behalf of the Western Mass Casino Task Force, the acronym for which is WMCAT. So if you hear WMCAT again, you know that's us. Anyway, as Tim pointed out, we were formed in the fall of 2007. The Munson Board of Selectmen became a little concerned when the Mohegan Sun said Palmer might be a great site for a casino, and we're saying, living right next door to them, ooh, what does that mean for us? And since we're a small community, 8,500 or so, we said it might be a good idea to involve some of the other communities in our area in looking at what the impacts might be to their communities. So we got folks together, and initially 10 of the surrounding communities, and now about 14, including Belchertown, Brimfield, Brookfield, Hamden, Holland, Ludlow, Munson, Palmer, Sturbridge, Wales, Ware, Warren, West Brookfield, and Wilbraham. So this was all pretty much centered on the Palmer area. Now, if this were Lenox or Lee, we probably wouldn't have come into existence. But, and the size of this committee and location of this committee may change depending on where the ultimate licensee in the Western Mass region turns out to be. We developed a mission statement early on that said to ensure that the economic, social, and quality of life interests of communities within the Western Massachusetts region are protected, and all impacts resulting from the development of a Class 3 casino gambling within the region are recognized. We had three objectives. Basically, to ensure that the Western region communities are included in every step of the public policy process for community development. That is, we really wanted a voice at the table. We wanted an opportunity to influence the legislation and whatever the legislation entailed going on once it was implemented. The second was to ensure that the state commits to funding for a professional, comprehensive, and unbiased study of the potential impacts, both positive and negative, of casino gambling on the Western region communities. That is one of the things I don't think we really accomplished, and we had been harping on that for about 5 years. But so be it. The third one, and perhaps the most important, was to ensure that casino-enabling legislation is amended to guarantee that the Western region communities receive adequate compensation for and mitigation of any negative impacts of casino development and operation. And it was in March of actually 2008 at Quinnipiac University where they hosted an informal forum on casino gambling and the social problems and impacts that are often ignored in the debates about them. And the most important takeaway, I wasn't there, I think Tim was. It was not very well attended. But the most important takeaway, bar none, was the response that Connecticut Attorney General Blumenthal gave in response to the question put to him, which was essentially, what is the biggest mistake that Connecticut made when it legalized casinos more than a decade ago that Massachusetts should learn from and strive hard not to repeat? So the Attorney General, without a moment of hesitation, said that Connecticut had completely failed to properly account for and proactively address the physical and social impacts that would fall to the communities surrounding the host community, and this was and continues, I emphasize continues, to be a serious omission with lots of adverse consequences that are regrettable. So WMCAT's official position on casinos is that we are neither pro nor anti-casino, and we have maintained that stance for this last 5 years. There are a lot of groups out there who are flag-waving for casinos for lots of reasons, and there are anti-casino groups out there. We're not one of those. We're neutral, and I think that has really opened the doors for us to be able to talk to legislators and people who will listen to our case, and we're very grateful for that. What have we done for the past 5 years? Well, it's like 1 year all over again every couple of years because we had to do this 3 times. First and most importantly, I think we enlisted the support of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and they have been enormously helpful to us. I don't think we'd have been able to do a very good job at this if it hadn't been for their support. They tape our meetings, record our minutes, and provide us with sound advice on how to proceed in dealing with the legislature and whatnot. We studied the proposed casino enabling legislation 3 times, met with local legislators, including Senators Candaris and Rosenberg, and our own local senator out in our area, Senator Brewer. We developed a list of 23 concerns, which we feel are generic enough for use by all potential host and surrounding communities who might be impacted. And copies of these, I think Tim left about 100 copies or so out on the table in the back if anybody would care to look at that. But we communicated our concerns on multiple occasions to the General Court and executive branches of mass government, mostly by letter, testified at public hearings held by the Joint Committee of Economic Development and Emerging Technologies several times. We did make a presentation just once to the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, who was interested in our work, and I think it was very well received by them, and I think they work very well together with our own group in the eastern part of the state. When the last set of legislation came up, we submitted amendments to proposed casino legislation through our regional legislators. And ultimately, today, we have produced a draft of a community impact checklist of items that communities should address prior to the casino licensing process. And I emphasize prior, because if you start doing this after the applications have been submitted, it may be too late. And copies of that should be included in the packet that you picked up with the agenda. And we welcome any suggestions or changes or additions, whatever you want. You can get back to either PVPC or myself, whatever. So I would like to think that the efforts of WMCAT have had a positive influence on the Massachusetts casino enabling legislation that was passed in 2011. From a local perspective, putting my selectman's hat on, what are we concerned about? We're always concerned about money. All municipal budgets are what we live and die by on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sure all of you are aware of especially the town officials are aware of what they've had to do to cut expenses due to the recession. Like them, we have foregone raises, laid off staff, reduced staff hours, and cut services. We don't have a lot of spare money to work on memoranda of understandings with potential casino licensees. So we need help in that area. And I think the legislation does allow for this. It's there in black and white. And for us, for example, being close to the Springfield area, if we're considered a surrounding community, and that's a concern to us, are we going to make that cut? If we were Palmer, that would be a no-brainer. If it were Springfield, there might be some question. But we might be looking at 3 or 4 casino applications. So that's 3 or 4 memoranda of understanding that we have to come up with. Part of that process, I think, is in order to be able to do that kind of negotiation, is to develop a baseline of community resources. That is infrastructure, transportation, public safety, education, housing, economic development, workforce development, public health, et cetera, all those kinds of things where we have resources within our individual communities. So each community has to do that for themselves. And I think that's a critical inventory to have, because it allows us to demonstrate where the impacts might be, and once the impacts do occur, if they do, that they're documented. So that would be the baseline for giving us a methodology for tracking impacts. We realized that or thought that the mitigation funds were not sufficient, but we're grateful for what we did get in the legislation, and it was probably more than it was initially anticipated. There'll be a great deal of competition, we think, for those mitigation funds. And since the host is included in that group with the surrounding communities, as a surrounding community selectman, we may not see an awful lot of that mitigation fund coming our way. And of course, there's always the quality of life for our community, but I'm not sure a lot of folks pay attention to that unless you can put an economic price on it. So how can the Mass Gaming Commission help us and the host communities as well as the surrounding communities? Communities need short-term help with the MOU process. We can't afford to hire legal counsel and/or consultants to assure that the results are going to be fair for everybody. Now, I was very pleased to see on July 24th that there was a press release by the MGC. It's number 12-019. And I'm not going to take the time to read it here, but it really says that the Commission has thought about this. They've taken to heart the message that we tried to get across, that mitigation is important to not only the host, but the surrounding communities. I think they could help, this Commission could help by perhaps developing appropriate templates for the information that has to be submitted to them, whether it's an MOU template or a community checklist or whatever kinds of information you folks need to do your job in selecting a licensee or approving a licensee, it might be helpful to have a template so that everybody's playing with the same set of rules. It's kind of like an RFP, if you will. And the community impact checklist, which I think you have copies of now, is something that the WMCAT produced, and it's a draft. We welcome any kind of comments from anybody that wants to change that, but I think it might be useful for communities to consider. We realize that one size does not fit all. That came across very loud and clear at the last presentation. I never thought it was an issue, because we all realize, being such small communities competing with larger communities, let's say like Springfield or Boston or Fall River, that it was pretty obvious that different communities have different requirements, depends on location and everything else. We think it's a good idea to retain the resources of regional planning agencies throughout the state for other regions, not just ours. They've been so helpful to us that I think it's a good approach to bring together those communities who think they are going to be impacted by a casino. And our WMCAT may morph into something quite differently depending on where the approved licensee winds up. So, and I think keeping the lines of communication open between us is pretty important going forward. And like I say, opportunities like this to communicate are well received. So, that's pretty much all I'd like to say, except to thank you once again and to thank Tim for all he does.
Ted, are we going to hold questions? How do you want to have us operate?
Up to you.
Well, I just wanted to see, you raised a really interesting point, Mr. Harrison, about how the mitigation monies, can everybody hear me? Is this working right? How the mitigation monies will be allocated. And one point that I wanted to make, you were afraid that the host communities might eat up the lion's share of the community mitigation monies that are generated each year as a small percentage of the revenues from the casinos, and the surrounding communities wouldn't get any. And one thing I just wanted to seize on immediately is both host and surrounding communities have the option to negotiate with the casino operator. Both surrounding communities and host communities have to have signed agreements before a proposal can come to us. So the first line of defense for mitigation monies ought to be your own direct negotiations as a host or surrounding community, and get everything you can possibly think of at that point, so that the commission monies, the mitigation monies that comes to the commission, is left for generally unanticipated or whatever. But you should not be thinking about, let's go get our money from the community mitigation fund. Every community ought to be thinking about getting whatever is appropriate mitigation monies from the operator up front.
Is this live? Oh, yes, it is. Point well taken. That's the first bite of the apple, and it's kind of an unknown out there what's going to happen. And we can only speculate as to what the impacts are going to be. But if we can't get an agreement and we've got a scant 30 days to accomplish that,
What is the 30 days?
we have 30. I think we have 30. Well, according to the legislation, I think it says 30 days to negotiate an MOU. Otherwise, the MGC steps in and makes sure that a license application includes that.
But if I could interject, I think the chairman's talking about even before the application process starts. The 30-day limitation only begins and kicks in after that, what we're calling the Phase 2 application occurs. The regulations that we promulgated yesterday, at least began the process of promulgating yesterday, anticipate the possibility of negotiations early on between host and surrounding communities and the developer for the kinds of things that the chairman was talking about.
Okay, that's a point well taken. I just want to make one point, though, that is that mitigation is not, in our eyes anyway, a one-shot deal that finishes with the completion of the construction of the project. It includes operation, not just development, and that could have an impact over years. If we had to hire 2 policemen, for example, to handle the increased DUIs or something like that, that's $100,000 or $150,000 perhaps when you consider it, if you've got to provide those on a three-shift basis. And that's an ongoing commitment for a long time that would take a small community like ours to absorb. So,
I do want to reinforce this, though. That ought to be one of the things that you're talking about to the developer up front. It should be, that ought to be what's part of the initial negotiation when they come to you as a surrounding community, or you purport to be a surrounding community. If you can't agree, then ultimately we will weigh in on that. But for the most part, the developers are going to want to have working relationships with surrounding communities, and part of the job should be to anticipate that you need 2 extra cops up front. And don't let that stuff slide, because we will run out of money quickly if the surrounding communities and host communities don't do a good job, a really buttoned up job of negotiating effectively with the developers way at the beginning of the process.
okay. So then I assume part of the criteria for selecting a licensee might be how well do you
Absolutely.
mitigate surrounding communities?
Absolutely,
Okay.
and this conversation is reinforcing that, but that's why this is a really important point, I think. If other communities haven't been really thinking this way, we would absolutely look very favorably. I think I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure we would all look very favorably on proposals that do a really good job of paying for mitigation with host and surrounding communities, for sure. The legislation requires us to consider that carefully.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'm going to try to tag team with Ed and drill a little bit deeper in the spirit of what Commissioner Stebbins says at the outset, that this is an educational forum, and particularly the Gaming Commission members are looking to receive information. I tried to ask myself 6 questions that you might, and then answer them. First question is there are a couple of definitions that are key when you talk about mitigation? And I think there are. In a general sense, mitigation typically means you're going to try to lessen, to the extent possible, any adverse consequences of a development. This one happens to be a casino, but it could be any kind of development. But not all the mitigation measures are the same. There are 3 categories. One is prevention measures, things that can be done up front as the project is actually designed that would either minimize or eliminate possible adverse impacts. Second is compensatory. Example being you clear the site, you take down a lot of trees, you replace the trees, maybe not precisely in the same location, but you do replace them on the development site. And then last but not least, remediation, where damage is done, but efforts are made as part of the whole development scheme to fix that damage or to restore a wetland, perhaps, that gets disturbed. This definition is the typical one, and planners like me use it all the time, but I think in this instance, it doesn't go far enough, and I would tweak it and say that there are also positive impacts of this kind of development. The premier one being the one that's already been mentioned several times, jobs. But I think to work that advantage takes work on the part of the host and the abutting communities as well as the Gaming Commission. And I think you're going to hear some ideas about that from panelists. Same is true with something like the hospitality industry. How can you work it at the front end so that there's mutual benefits rather than a winner and a loser? Casino, to a planner like me, is a DRI, not a DUI, a DRI, a development of regional impact. Not unusual. They exist all the time. Think shopping center, think airport, think large planned residential community. And many places, as close as Cape Cod, have explicit procedures for dealing with this. Some states do. I just heard from a colleague where the state of Georgia absolutely overhauled their procedures, and all those procedures are statewide, although they are implemented at each individual regional level. This is, I think, where the checklist, which Ed alluded to, comes into play. It's not intended to be a be-all and end-all. It's intended to be a starting point. We were at your forum in Framingham, and we heard that subject come up, and we heard your interest in it, and we thought our contribution to this would be get something on paper that could be shaped and reshaped over time. Second question, so what's the big deal about a casino? If DRIs, as I just said, exist all the time and everywhere, then why do these particular kinds of developments demand a higher level of attention? Well, this is an extraordinary DRI, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm just going to call out a few, and some are probably obvious. First, the scale. This is a supersized DRI. It's not a shopping center. It's not even something like an airport, although the footprint might be similar. It's a project with many pieces, and it's a generator of traffic, whether that be people traffic or traffic that arrives in vehicles. Second is the footprint. Clearly, if you adopt my idea that it's a DRI, the footprint is regional. It's not going to be only in the host community. The impacts will spill out, which brings us to why this committee that Ed just explained to you was created 5 years ago, and I know there's work going on in this regard elsewhere, including in the city of Springfield. Timeline, and I'm going to come back to this. The timeline is long. This is not a project that gets proposed this week and built perhaps in the next 6 to 12 months. It has a long pre-game warm-up period to it before actually a shovel gets in the ground. And that changes the dynamics of the process and the way you treat the project. Complexity, exceedingly high, demands the expertise of multiple disciplines, but not working sort of unilaterally, but working together. And I think your own composition is a way of reflecting that. Ed already alluded to, the community resources are limited, and some might argue in some cases austere. What I want to underscore is it's not just a matter of constraints in terms of money resources, it's also a constraint in terms of human resources. How many staff are in that town hall with the kinds of time and expertise that are going to be needed to respond appropriately to this? And last but not least, and I think that's why this is an educational, there's not a lot of precedent. This is not like we can run to some shelf and find wonderful examples. Sure, casinos exist elsewhere, but I think if you know anything about the legislation, the process, this is very, very unique. And so we're learning and doing at the same time. Not the easiest thing possible, and it's necessary to do. Question 3, why is a wholesale understanding of the timeline important here? I think, again, going back to an earlier statement, in terms of ultimately, this project will evolve in 4 separate time zones. Zone 1 is planning, permitting, licensing. The period we're in now, and by the Commission's estimate, will probably go till perhaps the fall of 2014. Following that, there's design, although presumably some design can go on before a particular licensee knows that they're successful. Third, construction phase, which again does not necessarily happen in all one bite. It very well may happen in phases, and it may take time to do. And fourth, Zone 4, the casino is in operation, and again, as I had alluded to, it's in operation, presumably in perpetuity. I think the key point I want to make now is in terms of mitigation, the most important period, time-wise, is this one, Zone 1, before an actual selection is made. I think that's a point that Chairman Crosby was just making. This is a time where you can shape things in a way that's, again, beneficial by all the parties. Later, may be much more difficult or impossible to achieve. There's one question about mitigation that hardly ever gets asked, but I'm going to ask it. And I'm going to give you my answer, but I don't necessarily think it's going to get unanimous agreement. The question is it realistic to believe every impact of a casino in this case, but again, could be another type of project, can be mitigated? I think the answer to that is probably not. So I think, again, when you think about mitigation, probably there's three principles that ought to come into play. The first is be realistic about the mitigation measures. Second, because you can't do everything, be targeted in the way you apply those mitigation measures. And thirdly, mitigation needs to be funded to the extent, again, that mitigation is possible to afford. Question 4, are the types of projects impacts more or less the same? Again, whether it be a large-scale project or, in this case, a casino resort facility. No. Once again, I think there's three distinct types of impacts to be thinking about, worrying about, and planning for. First would be the direct impacts, and I'm just going to give some hypothetical examples. There's an intersection close to the casino location that ultimately gets picked. That intersection fails based upon the traffic. Direct impact, and something needs to be done to compensate for that factor. Indirect impacts. Again, very, very important. What about the school system that's 2 communities out that suddenly has an explosion of school population and a population that may also have special needs that's never been anticipated? We heard a lot about that when we were in Connecticut, so something again to think about. And then last but not least, the cumulative impacts. I imagine that a project like this is going to be built in phases, but you have to anticipate what the cumulative impacts are going to be. Not when the parking lot is finished, or even the casino is finished, but all the pieces. You have to think beyond what actually gets built perhaps in phase 1 or 2 or 3. What kind of considerations go into this whole salad bowl of mitigation? Well, there'll be a lot, but probably the premier ones would be physical. How is the water and sewer infrastructure going to deal with this development? Natural, what's going to happen to water quality or air pollution? Social, how about things like public safety and problem gaming? Fiscal, you already heard Ed talk about those. Legal, there's a lot of complicated legal agreements, and again, many of the communities that we try to serve would not have that expertise in town hall. Economic, again, how do you make sure the benefits from the economic side are there? And then staffing, how do we get the capacity staff-wise and expertise that we need to make this front end, this zone 1 time zone that I'm alluding to, work the best? If I had to guess, sitting in the seat of a municipal official that's worrying about these kinds of issues, there's probably 3 in this moment that are most compelling, most urgent. And I think you've heard them many times before, but I'm going to repeat them. Staffing capacity, legal expertise, and answers to the fiscal questions that have come up repeatedly. Question 5, who's responsible for maximizing the chances that the mitigation mix that you put together are effective and successful? The short answer is everybody, everybody at interest. There's a role for the Gaming Commission, and in that regard, one thing that you're going to struggle with, because we have, and that is, what are the surrounding communities? Where does that begin and end? And that's a call that the Gaming Commission is going to have to make at some point in time. And that's probably something where group thinking would be very helpful. We struggle with it, and we have, as Ed alluded to, 14, 15 communities. But I think we all would acknowledge that the impacts in all 14 or 15 municipalities are not going to be the same. The host community has a role in terms of its negotiation. The impacted communities have a role in terms of what they see as the priority mitigation measures, what are at the top of the priority list. The developer clearly has a role, both in the early stage of negotiation, but likewise the follow-through on design. Because again, those preventative measures are the ones that are the cheapest, but get you the biggest positive bounce. The more they're built into the actual construction, the more the benefits for all. And clearly, the developer, once they get a yay or nay from the commission, will be in the driver's seat in that regard. And for that matter, the public at large has a role in terms of having their questions brought forward and answered, or bringing suggestion forward. We've certainly benefited for that over the last 5 years. Question 6, Ed already started, and I'm going to give you what I would suggest as 6 asks of the Gaming Commission in the context of mitigation. And I would say right up front, several of these are repeats, and they're repeats purposely because they're important and they need to be underscored yet again. So my list would go something like this. Recognize through your process and regulations that the one-size-fits-all proposition is real, and that a level of flexibility is built in so that the way that's responded to a site in Western Mass is not necessarily a mirror copy of what might happen in the greater Boston area. Continue, because you've already started, to pursue measures and to provide resources that level the playing field essentially between the developer and the communities, whether that be the host community or that be the surrounding communities. A level playing field, again, fits all. But you have to help in that regard, and I know you already have started down that road. Self-serving, but use the regional planning agencies to advantage. Most of us were created a half-century ago for exactly this purpose. We typically bring expertise in some of the key areas: transportation, environment, mitigation, etc. But also, in a sense, we are the region's kitchen table. We're the place where communities come together. That is our customer. That's who we work with all the time. And I think to the extent that you can use the RPAs, that is beneficial to the region and to your work as well. Fourth, look for ways to reward good behavior on the part of casino developers. And I think you've, again, suggested a couple of ways even today about that. But I would look for ways in all of those time zones that the criteria that you include in your weighing the decision, the hard one, as to which will be the project that's the winner, is really important. And that includes this phase as well. Ed has already said this, but again, I'll reinforce: maximize the Gaming Commission as the hub of sustained communication between and among all the parties. Because again, I think that's helpful. And you've already done that, whether through your website, through the forums, through the fact that you've taped the forums, so even if you couldn't get to them, you can benefit That's all important in terms of maximum communication strategy. And your chairman just did it, so I'm going to repeat it. Champion the notion that the time to be engaged and to be proactive and to act is now. It's not next week, it's not next month, it's certainly not 2 years from now. The time to act is now because from a mitigation point of view, early in means much more benefits. I do want to join Ed in thanking the Gaming Commission because it's clear from this forum and previous ones that you have been listening. And I think that's given us high level of comfort to communities, particularly ones that I've been working with over the last 5 years that have struggled with the mitigation issue and many, many others. Thanks.
Just one quick point of clarification. You referred to the licensing phase, the first of the 3 phases, as being over, we had said, by the fall of 14. That was actually the outside date. We said between the fall of 13 and the fall of 14.
Yeah, I said estimate. That was my best guess at what you meant. But the timetable, too, was something helpful in terms of framing to some degree. It's not just sort of black space. Okay, our next panelist is Jeffrey Simon, who serves as the director of the Massachusetts Recovery and Reinvestment Office. This is a key office established in the Commonwealth under direct supervision of the governor that dealt with the over $7 billion of stimulus money that came to the Commonwealth over the last several years. Before he was returned to sort of public service, he has worked both on the public and the private sector. I think the bedrock of his career is it's always been related to real estate development, whether it be in Massachusetts as the director of the land bank, as we once knew it, or working in offshore locations, Bermuda, replanning former military bases. So I think, again, his perspective to this discussion will be very helpful. Jeff?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. As Tim mentioned, I have a fair amount of experience in large-scale development, working on a lot of really great projects all over Massachusetts, and have had the opportunity to be both the public partner and the private partner in some really great public-private partnerships. So the perspective that I bring is really, as with all of us, is tempered by our experience. But what I've learned is that that understanding the perspective of both sides and trying to de-demonize the use of the term sides is really a key to success, particularly for communities. The most on-point experience that I've had that I want to talk a little bit about today is I was the director of the redevelopment of Fort Devens for 4 years. So when Fort Devens closed, it was in 4 communities, Ayer, Harvard, Shirley, and Lancaster. We had a little bit of a different issue that when the United States Army created Fort Devens, they really weren't cognizant in any way of town boundaries, so you had major buildings with town boundaries going right through the middle of them. And when we sat down and tried to look at the regulatory framework and how we would actually encourage development from both the state and the municipal point of view, it just didn't seem to make sense to have the building inspector for Ayer be responsible for one end of the building and the building inspector for Harvard be responsible for the other. So situations like that really get you to force you to take a different approach on things that you quite frankly take for granted. And what you learn in large-scale development is that large-scale development is really at its essence about reconciling competing and opposing interests. It is all about balance, what the economists call Pareto optimality, which is simply doing the most positives, getting the most positives with the least negatives. It's about balancing the developer's interests with the community's interests, and short-term considerations with long-term considerations, and economic gains with the social impact and potential changes to quality of life. I've done a lot of speaking on the impacts of large-scale development, and one of the experiences that I've had that I like to relate is a conversation that I've had a number of times. That's a very difficult conversation. A difficult conversation is talking about a 20-year development with a 2-year mayor. It takes the time frames and it butts them up against each other. And I never fail, you can always tell the people who are actually in municipal government, like Jay Ash sitting in the front here, because when I say that, they all smile and shake their heads, because they've had to deal with that. They've had to deal with those competing interests. And regardless of the type of development, that issue is really at its essence what we all struggle with, particularly when you recognize that in Massachusetts, the regulatory system is based on a whole lot of volunteer citizens who meet every 2 weeks, once a month, maybe, and it really doesn't contemplate, it doesn't anticipate the kind of major development impacts that a large development of any type, and everything that I say today, will be regardless of the type of development. I'm not speaking specifically to casino development, I'm talking about the impacts of large-scale developments. Those impacts, when I think about them, I want to talk about dividing them up into 4 different kinds of quadrants. And one of the things that I try and do is keep up on what other people do in the field. And there's a professor at the University of Illinois named Mary Edwards who's kind of created a framework that I like to use. And the impacts end up being divided up for today, the community impacts, into 4 different general categories, 2 general and 2 specific. Fiscal, which is really dealing with community costs and revenues. Socioeconomic, dealing with the demographics, some of the things people have mentioned before. Community image and aesthetics, dealing with what I've heard so much, particularly in working on large-scale development. It's generally that elusive character of the community. And when you do a lot of this kind of development, you get kind of a mental image of, some guy running around with a T-shirt that there goes the character of the community. But it really is what makes that community unique, what makes people want to live there who do live there. What is it that you value, and what is it that you want to preserve? And then third, the environmental impacts. Some of these are obvious. They've been talked about before: air, water, but vegetation, wildlife, and sometimes the environmental impacts, particularly in some of the work that I've done on military-based redevelopment, can be quite positive, quite frankly. And if you can have positive impacts on cleanup or environmental remediation worked into the process, that's a real boon. And then lastly, and it's a particular interest here, traffic. Traffic always deserves kind of its own section, its own considerations. And I'd like to just talk briefly about each one of them. Fiscal analysis. So this really looks at the impact on the government of the community. And Massachusetts in particular, where we have so many different kinds of forms of government, some of which are all volunteer, without any real permanent or full-time staff, it really is important to look at the costs and the impacts on that government in terms of revenue and in terms of its ability to do that kind of costing. And there's 2 ways generally that the economists look at it. One is the average cost. So you just kind of look at what your costs are to provide schools, fire, police, trash pickup, all of those kinds of issues. You figure out how many new people there'll be, and you just multiply. Very straightforward. But what that doesn't really take into consideration is the way that services grow and the way that communities grow. And that gets into the second approach, which is called a marginal costing approach. So it looks at the cost at the margin of providing one more unit of whatever service that is. That becomes particularly important to cities and towns if you think about how they staff up. Because development occurs, and development occurs as Tim talked about, at a fairly predictable kind of smooth rate. Yes, there are different plateaus, but it's fairly predictable. It's reasonably well known. Your staff, however, doesn't, particularly in a town. So that what'll happen is that you'll hire that staff, they'll come in and start to deal with it, and you won't even think about going to the legislative body, the selectmen or the aldermen or the city council, until that staff member is so overworked that he or she can't see straight. And then you're going to hire one more. You're not going to hire two more, you're going to hire one more. And then that same pattern's going to repeat itself. So as the development picks up, then you'll have two people. And two people are going to go nuts. And when they're right at the point where they're ready to hang it up and move to Vermont, you're going to hire one more. And that's kind of how the pattern will go. The difficulty in that is that lumpy nature of providing public services gets repeated all throughout the different departments of town government. And in projecting the fiscal impacts, it's important to recognize that you can't have a real smooth kind of progression. So generally, you start by looking at the population and the employment changes. You try to disaggregate the budgets into residential impacts and non-residential impacts. You look at both the revenues and the costs for each one of those two major kind of divides, and then they come back together at the bottom, and you start to be able to project the fiscal impacts on your city or town government. One of the major limitations of that impact analysis is that it doesn't really look at the interactions among those uses. It just looks at kind of an additive effect. And there are interactions that take place. It also only looks at a single unit of government and kind of puts blinders on as if the impact didn't kind of spill over in lots of different ways. So a couple questions. What are the spending categories that major developments are going to impact in your city or town? Are there new services that are not existent at all today that will be necessary? Will it prompt changes in the way that you deliver services? And I know I was on the school committee in my town for 9 years, and when we looked at fiscal impact, we tried to anticipate wholesale changes to the way that those services would be provided, and it's very difficult. So in addition to the staff, you need to look at the impact on things like police response times or fire response times and the location of those services and the cost. Now on socioeconomic impact assessment, that really looks at the other side, which is the impact on community life. It looks at demographics, it looks at retail analysis, it looks at housing market analysis. It looks at the demand for public services, but not necessarily the cost of those services. And it looks at changes in in employment and income levels that might take place through these changing demographics in your community. And it tries to roll all that up into that aesthetic quality of the community that ends up with you looking at yourself and saying, what do we want this community to be? Not today, not tomorrow, but in 50 or 100 years. It really deals with the hopes and the dreams and the aspirations that all of us have in the communities that we live in, and that's such an important part of the system of American democracy. It looks at the density and distribution of people within the town. It looks at the mix between permanent workers and temporary workers and the difference in demands that that makes. It looks at the existing land use and the zoning plans to deal with those land uses, and needs that to be examined for the impact on the new development that is occurring and the impact of the new development that's occurring. So again, it's both sides of those same questions. It also looks at the impact on your retail areas. In my work at Fort Devens, we saw dramatic changes to downtown Ayer, for example, when that base closed. 17,000 people went to work there every day. When I came in, those 17,000 people were gone. Restaurants, dry cleaners, building suppliers, carpet sellers, all of those kinds of people all had significant impacts on the retail side. And on public services, the mix that's appropriate today may not be the mix that's appropriate for tomorrow. Third are the environmental impacts. There's a whole industry built around dealing with environmental impacts, and a lot of people who do a great job at this. But it generally looks at the size and the nature of development, the location of the development, the character of the environment that's being impacted, and then the spillover effects of those environmental impacts. And it categorizes those into the subject areas of open space and air and water on both sides, water provision and water treatment or wastewater treatment. So there's a whole cycle that needs to be looked at. And today, one of the most important considerations end up being the demand for power. Power is becoming such a commodity that is determining development and determinative of development, that its environmental impacts need to be included in that. And then fourth and last, deserving its own category, as I mentioned, is traffic. Tim talked about a lot of the issues of traffic that need to be looked at by a really solid traffic engineer. You need to look at the impacts across your community, on primary roads, on secondary roads, on feeder roads, on tertiary roads, on driveways, quite frankly. You need to look at how those existing patterns will be influenced and where your failing intersections are going to be and what kind of a knock-on effect that's going to have going down the line. I know that the intersection that is right in the middle of Ayer, for those of you who drive that area, had huge effects on the town of Groton. But the town of Groton wasn't really involved in the process of redevelopment, much like you have communities impacted and surrounding communities and then the surrounding communities. And I may not be using the terms right, but I think you know where I'm going with that. And then probably those larger impacts need to be addressed on a regional basis, but the projections need to be realistic. And we have dealt in large-scale development with all kinds of projections on both sides, either completely minimizing the impact or just taking a worst case that way overstates it. But you need to remember that it's reasonably hard to change traffic issues once they've occurred. So you want to really think them through. It's not impossible, but major drastic changes are hard to do. So overall, I'd say evaluating both the positive impacts and the negative impacts of development is important. Focusing on significant impacts, and this is a real discipline, focusing on the significant impacts and not on those nominal impacts of development is a huge challenge, particularly because there will be someone in your community who is only focused 100% on a very small impact. But that's what they care about, and that impact and that opinion deserves consideration, but it can't dictate the development. Looking at direct impacts, and as Tim said, the cumulative impacts of each one of those decisions today and down the line will give you a better sense of where you're going overall. And looking at the long-term goals and trying to assess what they are for the community will give you the guide. I think there's a great opportunity here to actually think this through up front and to negotiate with all of the potential developers or operators beforehand. So I'd give you a couple points in conclusion. First of all, people need to participate. It's been said before, but it bears repeating that democracy is not a spectator sport. You need to participate. Second, realize the limitations. Recognize the limitations, particularly of your governments, and plan for them. Hire consultants. I've run a number of major development competitions, and the goal of the development competition is to get as many developers with as high quality proposals knocking at everyone's door as possible. And realizing that, you don't want to shut the door, you want to make it easy for your communities to deal with developers. And so therefore, you need to organize for success. You need to plan for success. You can't put up the walls and the barriers, because that frankly won't serve your population very well. And you can't at the same time pretend that major development is just like any other development and just say, okay, the planning board meets once a month, that's good enough for this development, they're just going to have to wait. Because that won't serve your community well. Certainty of regulation fairly applied is what the development community really looks for. Notice I didn't talk about the amount of regulation or the intensity of regulation at all. It's just certainty of regulation. If they do A, B, C, and D that you've asked them to do, they know at the end of that, that permit will be forthcoming. And they know that not only are they being asked to do A, B, C, and D, but all developers are being asked to do that, and it's the same A and the same B and the same C and the same D. And make that developer a part of your community. It's in their interest and it's in your interest. And think creatively and work regionally. Very few impacts recognize town boundaries. So I would say in conclusion, thinking through the approach, minimizing emotional impacts, emotional responses, and maximizing professional responses will really serve your community well. And last, just plan for the long term. Recognize that this is a 100-year decision that you are undertaking today and tomorrow. Treat it with the respect that it deserves. And I think that you'll serve your communities very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Very helpful. Last but not least, we're joined by Monica Lamboy. Monica is now associated with the Collins Center at UMass, but I think her role today is really talking about her most recent experience before that, which was working in Somerville, where they have a large project called Assembly Square, if I'm not mistaken, and also bringing in a transit line to which Monica was trying to, again, align the transit system with some of the development, particularly at the nodes. Monica?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Monica Lamboy. I'm a senior associate at the Edward J. Collins Center for Public Management at UMass Boston. If you're not yet familiar with the Collins Center, we were created by the state legislature about 4 years ago to offer technical assistance to cities and towns in areas such as governance, charter reform, executive recruitment, organizational studies. So we're here to help. But what I'm here today to do at this forum on mitigation is to talk about relationships. What specifically I like to talk about is the relationship between the community, the municipality, and the developer. And I allege that if those three groups can work together successfully, you can get through the mitigation process in a forthright manner that creates good outcomes, and you can get through the construction and the operation phases, but that care and attention needs to be paid to the relationship. You could liken it to a three-legged stool where the community, the developer, and the municipality are all individual legs of that stool. So they each need to be strong in and of themselves, but they have to come together as one to create a stable environment for the conversation and the work. Another way to think about it is this is your next long-term relationship that you are embarking on, because the developer and the operator will be here not only through the construction process, but hopefully for years to come as they're operating in the community. And those types of relationships need care and attention. What I'd like to do is highlight a project that I had the good fortune to work on for 4 years, and then try to pull back and think of some of the lessons that I learned and I saw in the process. So hopefully I can get it. So the Assembly Square project, Assembly Row, is in Somerville, and it's a few short miles away from downtown Boston. Will ultimately be 3 transit stops on the Orange Line from North Station. So it's right in the urban core, but it's been sort of a donut hole in a way with little or no development. This is just a little bit closer where you can see the Orange Line running north and south through the area and along the Mystic River, which is a beautiful waterway that doesn't get a lot of attention. Zooming in a little bit further, the entire urban renewal area is 145 acres in size. The development that's called Assembly Row is 56.2 of those acres. So it's a very large project, but it's really a subset of what's going to become quite of a large neighborhood. The history is long, the project is long, the history is long. The Ford car manufacturer opened an assembly plant on this site in 1926. That then closed in 1958, leaving a very large building, a large shell, and some other buildings on the site. It was converted to an indoor shopping mall that failed in 1999. And then the question is what happens next? In 2000, an IKEA store was permitted on the waterfront, meaning literally on the Mystic River. And while there were some design elements that were different from the standard IKEA, the basic large box in a sea of surface parking was the basic design of the facility. This was adjacent to the mall area. What happened then was a group of residents called the Mystic View Task Force came together to litigate against the permit. And here's what's interesting. They didn't just say, we don't want this. They actually said, we want that. And what they said that they wanted was a transit-oriented, pedestrian-oriented, mixed-use development with a large amount of commercial square footage to improve the tax base of the city and a waterfront that was open and welcoming to all. So they didn't just say no, they said, yes, we want this. As a result of their clear picture of what they wanted, a developer came forward and said, yes, I can offer that. That's the Federal Realty Investment Trust that had done tremendous work in Bethesda Row, Rockville Town Square in Maryland, and Santana Row in California. And they married the community's vision with their business model and said, we think we might have a partnership here. So after discussion, a settlement agreement was reached in 2007, letting the project start to go forward. What we have planned, what is planned, is 1.75 million square feet of new office space, 852,000 square feet of retail, a 200-room hotel, and 2,100 residential units built on a grid pattern, looking out on the water, accessed by a train station, because people had an idea of a vision and others responded to that. What does this mean in terms of numbers? $1.36 billion in private and public investment on the site, in infrastructure, open space, and amenities, including a $50 million new transit station, which is pictured on the top left, 2 pictures, and a new 5-acre open space park on the waterfront. This is estimated to produce around 10,000 permanent jobs and 10,000 construction jobs. So the pictures look pretty, but where are we today? It's actually under construction. They are building the first 3 blocks. There's also a small retail building, and the work on the train station has started. So reflecting on where we are in this economy, how could such a large development launch at such a time? What were the pieces that helped make that successful, albeit over a long term? And why do they think it's an okay risk to do at this time period? What I want to offer is a few key elements to success. First, establish a community or a common vision. Second, for the municipality to provide support, but to maintain its objectivity. Everyone to know that there's going to be bumps in the road, and to recognize that change is difficult. It's not fast. So in terms of establishing a vision, importantly, cultivating leadership at all levels is vitally important, from the elected officials to the staff, to the public agencies, to the developers, and the community at the table. The residents that are involved can speak to other residents in a way that no one else can. Business leaders that can get involved can talk to other businesses to understand their concerns, their questions, and can relay those and also give information back. That network of people who all come to the table with different skill sets and different relationships and different strengths can create a tremendous team that'll help carry you through those challenging periods. Acknowledge existing conditions, kind of what Jeff was talking about. What about our community is really precious to us that we want to retain? Is it the design of the city center? Is it a certain aspect of our quality of life? What are the things that are not so successful right now? Do we have congestion or some areas of development that aren't been so successful? If there's infrastructure involved, are there impacts from some transportation decisions? Have our neighborhoods been severed by roadways that haven't been successful? Are there public health impacts of some of the aspects that we're dealing with? Importantly, looking at the services that we offer today and what we'd really like to offer, do we have the revenue base to provide what the community needs? And is there an imbalance between the residential property tax base and the commercial property tax base that could be remedied through thoughtful development? What does it mean if we have limited infrastructure, if part of our town is on sewer and on well? Do we have the capacity to offer other kinds of infrastructure if we move together forward? And while figuring out your vision, look at who's been successful. There's nothing wrong with stealing ideas from somebody who has been successful and face the same challenges that you have. Of course, your community is special and different, but there may be something to be gleaned. This is a project I talk about a lot, the Fruitvale Transit Village in Oakland, California, where a large surface lot separated a transit station from a neighborhood, and the public traffic, the BART agency was about to build a parking structure completely in between the neighborhood and the train station. Here's an example again where the residents came together and said, we don't want that. What we want to do is connect to the train station. And after many years worth of work, there's a mixed-use project with a library and a senior center and housing, and there is a direct connection from that neighborhood to the train station that everybody is benefiting from. They built the parking off to the side, which was always an option. Promote a culture that's open to change. Community participation is vitally important when you're talking about change. And there are so many tools and so many great ways to do it right now that it doesn't have to be a forum where there's just one microphone and one person's talking and everybody is sitting and listening. There are electronic tools, there's visual modeling where you can swoop in and feel what a site looks like. There's new ways of having conversations like World Cafes where lots of conversations happen in the same room and then they coalesce at the end so that everybody's participating and you're not, the intensity that happens when someone gets a microphone doesn't take place because you're having lots of small conversations. Provide support but maintain objectivity is me really talking to my peers out there in the municipalities. We have to walk a fine tightrope between the community and the developer at times, or maybe a balance beam might be a more apt illusion to use at this point in time. But as soon as it looks or it feels that you are leaning one way or leaning another way, people will grab onto that and you will have lost trust. So maintaining that objectivity throughout the process is important. The technical team, assemble your technical team. There needs to be information to the elected officials, to the members of the community. Who needs to be on your team? What are the technicians that you need to have access to? And how do you get that information out so that people can review it? There were many times in my job where community people would read intense environmental documents that we were trying to read at the same time, but they would pick up something that we would have missed. And Fortunately, we have them available, and people will do that if you give them access to the information. Establish your working relationship early. How often are you going to meet? When are you going to meet? Who's going to be there? Write it down. What pieces of the project is the town going to be responsible for? What's the developer going to be responsible for? Who else is going to be doing things? Document, 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 create a work plan. Maintain design control. I think it's important for the municipality to maintain design control. One, it helps create the reflection of that community character that you wanted. Two, as things get underway and resources get tight, sometimes there's a desire to downgrade or modify a design because it's more affordable. But it's important for the community to maintain the design control so that they can at least have that conversation in front of a board, a planning board, or in a public forum. On the other hand, I would say it's important for some level of discretion to be at the staff level so that you don't lose time when tiny minor changes have to happen in the design, because time lost means money. And you can really get some great work. On the slide here on the bottom right-hand side, that's actually a public storage building that is on a high-profile location. So we said we want to have a really great, really rich design that you don't normally see in a public storage facility. Additionally, because of the design process, we were able to require them to build floor plates that could be converted to other uses in the future. So the building is convertible to office if the market shifts at some point in time. So it was only because they had to go through a permit process that we could have such a dialogue about what do we really want it to look like. And get material boards so that you know exactly what the materials are that are going to be out there, and then the people who go out to inspect can make sure that that's what you got. What they put in writing is what you're going to get. Know there's going to be bumps in the road. Everyone can hope for the best, but how often does that always happen complete to its fruition? Or, and if it did, how many bumps did you have to get through to get there? So there's big things that happen: the national and regional economy, financing challenges, things that look like they were going to come through that didn't, regulatory agencies that come out of nowhere that you didn't know how to roll in the project and suddenly said, here I am, now you have to pay attention to me. Market timing, and sometimes there's positive bumps. The ERA monies was a positive bump in the road that was not expected, and everybody had to come together to really take advantage of that opportunity, and people really did, from the state to the local level, to get money for the Assembly Square project. But the development agreement, in terms of challenges, is going to be an important tool to lay out specific deliverables, specific timelines, and what are the accountability measures if the timelines are missed, whether it's a timeline that the municipality was supposed to undertake or something that the development team was going to undertake. What is the repercussion if that happens? Consider what's going to trigger a major amendment versus a minor amendment, or some things that we can just do outside of the agreement. Figure out what's plan B, what's plan C, maybe what's plan D. I mean, I hate to say this, but what is the worst case scenario for the proposal that you're working with, and how do you address it if it happens? If it stops mid-construction, how does the municipality get that site active again? Do they have an opportunity to take it through eminent domain? Do they have a right of first refusal? What is that scenario that you never want to have happen, and think it through now, and try to plan for it in your written agreement. Also, an important thing to think about is what is the do not cross line? When is the ask too big that we have to say, despite all the years of work that we've put in, we can't cross this line? It's very easy to sort of incrementally increase the public commitment to a project, and then at the end of the day, only step back then and realize, oh wow, this is a totally different package than when we started. So is there a line that's a do not cross line? Recognize that change is difficult. If we think in our own lives, you know, when your spouse asks you, stop putting that wet towel on the bed, how hard it is to change our behavior. We're actually talking about a large development now, which is going to change people's lives. We can mitigate, which is great and is helpful, but there is change. And the default is to do nothing. The community knows what the status quo is. I know what life is like today. I may not be totally excited about it. It may not be perfect, but I know it. I've touched it. I can feel it. I know what it is. Now we're trying to introduce something completely new. So they have to feel comfortable enough to know that that new thing is something that they want. Because the knee-jerk reaction is to say, no, I'm safe today. What you're offering me is too much change and too much chaos, and I don't know what it really means. So the default is to do nothing, and that's probably not a good for anybody. In closing, the real message is to communicate, communicate, communicate. There's so many ways to communicate right now that there really shouldn't be a situation where somebody comes to the table and says, I'm opposing this because you didn't tell me. You never want to fight the fight. You didn't tell me, therefore I don't want it, because you can't win that argument. Then you have to go back to the beginning and go through that same conversation that you had with everybody else, with that person that came forward, in order to bring them to where you are. So think about the communication plan and think about how to keep this relationship strong throughout the process. Thank you.
So I guess this is the place for any other questions that the commission may have before we go to break.
I had a question, and kind of, Ed, your comments alluded to me. The fact that as you considered budgetary issues, how did education pop up, or did it?
I'm sorry, what?
How did you ever have a question about school funding, or look at that, or attempt to you would have to mitigate that as well?
That's one of the 23 items on our list of concerns that we initially developed. The education, and especially on an ongoing basis, if there's English language learning requirements that come along that we haven't anticipated, where we have to hire more teachers with different skills. But schools are definitely part of that. And I know there are towns in our group who say if we have one more student that comes into the town, they're going to have to build a new school. I mean, that's a little bit of poor planning and foresight of what's going to happen in the future, because most towns are growing at some rate. So,
If I could add a PS to that, there's a mitigation measure that can be effective there too, and that's hiring from within the region and the community in which the casino is going to happen. Again, when we looked at Connecticut, it appeared that the workforce essentially came in from out of the state, pushed the population up, and then led to these other needs. So to the extent that, and again, that's a separate panel, that you're able to employ folks that are here in the valley, I think that's a mitigation strategy actually on the fiscal side.
My second question would be to Jeffrey and Monica. I mean, you gave a lot of great advice, suggestions, recommendations as to how a community can prepare to negotiate a host agreement, potentially prepare for all the impacts, as well as what I'd call a behavior or attitude that you bring to the discussions, the objectivity, but obviously interested in seeing the project go forward. Turn your hat around and think of yourself as a developer. What recommendations would you have for a developer to also have a positive effect on the process?
Well, as a developer, I would much rather deal with a competent, experienced person on the other side of the table who has the opposite opinion of mine than I would to deal with someone who just doesn't have the experience or the understanding of the terms of the discussion. That's hard. I don't know that people with those kinds of skills exist in all the communities that are going to be impacted. So I think that hiring people to advise you on your side, to help you negotiate, who speak that language, who understand the constraints of financing, puts on any development, and who understand some of the development process details would really stand you in good stead. And I'm not sure how else you do it if you don't have people who really have that experience. I just agree with Monica's point that you need to know where the line is and get right up to it, but not go over it.
I would add to that. I would think for a developer, money well spent is money given for technical assistance to help the communities. Because if the hard questions don't get asked and answered, you're not going to be able to create the compelling package that says that, yes, we should go forward with this. If people feel like there's been a stone that hasn't been turned over, they're going to ask for it. So being able to staff up the communities or get them access to consultants that they need is vitally important.
I have a question that I'm not sure can be answered today, but I'd at least like to throw it out for future thinking. The final application, the Phase 2 application, has 19 or 20 statutory criteria that have to be considered. We can add additional ones, but there are 19 or 20 statutory criteria. 2 of those focus on regional impact, and the application has to be accompanied by studies showing the regional impact. From the outset, I've been concerned about how to evaluate those studies. What does the Commission do when it looks at those studies? And particularly studies in a competitive environment where you have 2 to 3 or 4, or however many it is, proposals, each of which has an assessment of its regional impact, and they probably will not be congruent. So I would welcome some assistance from the regional authorities, or regional groups, ad hoc groups, statutory groups, on creation of a mechanism for evaluating, helping us evaluate the accuracy and reliability and merit of those various studies. And now it seems to me is the time to begin thinking about that and planning for it and coming up with proposals, because it seems to me too that the indigenous perspective, neutral indigenous perspective, or at least removed indigenous perspective, would be the most helpful.
I think the best answer I can provide is that all the regional planning agencies, including my own, which has responsibility for 43 cities and towns, review every single MEPA that comes in to the office. Every project that's subject to the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act comes in for this kind of scrutiny. We oftentimes are the surrogate staff for the communities in which this particular project is going to. And we feel our job is to do a good job in teasing out whether the mitigation measures are appropriate, the ones that are positive, celebrate them, those that are missing, call for them. We don't actually get the final decision. We get to recommend, but that's a role that we've played for decades.
You know, if I could just add to that and underscore it, there was a lot of talk in the various people's comments about making the regional planning commissions the partner of the municipality, but they also should be the partner of the commission. Just as the commission needs to understand those regional impacts and doesn't necessarily have the ability to, as you said, look at all the different reports on the same project and know, which ones are really standing the test of time. And then the second thing is I think that what you can do is look at 2 things, and one is the methodology that's used, and the second is the source of information. And if the methodology is correct and the information sources are the right sources, then the result of that should stand scrutiny.
Just one other PS that hasn't come up to my recollection. Another part of mitigation oftentimes that comes up in these MEPA reviews is the proponent says, this is what's going to happen with traffic. And they've done a good job, but we're not sure they're on the money. And so what we'll say is monitor, see what actually happens a year or 2 or 3, put that into the permit, and then if they're right, hands off. But if the mitigation has sort of been understated, bring in more after the fact. which seems a fair way to try to deal with situations that are not absolutely black or white.
That's similar to something I was just thinking about, Tim, that the host and surrounding communities ought to put those kinds of clauses in their agreements as well, because you're not going to be able to know for sure what's happening. But if part of your agreement is that you reopen the discussion in 3 years, 2 years, whatever, then you're set for that. But if you forget it, if you look at it as a one snapshot in time and just negotiate around that, then you're going to have the problem that Tim suggests. So I think that's a really good idea, and the host and surrounding communities ought to be aware of that as well. I had one question. We talked about this at our other mitigation forum in Framingham. Ultimately, as we've discussed, the commission will have the authority to determine what will be considered a, quote, surrounding community and what will not. And of course, we haven't really given any thought to it yet, but we're going to need some kind of mechanism by which we determine what is a surrounding community other than just our own ad hoc whimsy, maybe. Now, I can sort of imagine it must mean some kind of community that has material adverse effects, but what's that? And probably in the planning world, in the community planning world, in the regional planning world, there are ways to measure this that would be helpful to us to come up with a metric, a template, a format, a value system, something that will help us when the time comes to determine what is a surrounding community. You can speak to it now if you want to, but also I'd just ask you all and everybody else who's listening that this is an area where we're going to need help as time unfolds.
We're happy to hear that because I think this is one of those cases where the wisdom of crowds may come to bear. There are materials out there. We've looked at some from other states, from other regions. But as I say, the difference here is that this process in Massachusetts is quite different from other places. So I think you can cherry pick some ideas out, but there's going to have to be some judgment calls. But it's a hard decision, and we'd be happy to help you in any way we can.
Thank you all. We'll take a quick break and we'll set up for the next panel, but thank you very much.
Great panels.